Welcome everybody to this fifth retreat on St Aidan's Day. St Mary's Church had morning prayer at 8 and we'll have another one at 5, especially for St Aidan, and the Catholic Church has a Mass at 11 and another one at 1, St Aidan's Church. And in St Mary's this morning it started with these words: Lindisfarne, holy island, washed everlastingly by the waves of the sea, you beheld the spiritual struggles and feats of holy Aidan. Your very stones bear witness still to his faithfulness to Christ. And the very stones also bear witness to the heritage of Aidan's mission, even though he had a lot of setbacks, heartbreaks and failure, and he may even have died of a broken heart. But there was what I call an apostolic succession, not from Rome in this case, but from heaven. And we know the story so well that when Aidan was dying on the 31st of August, a young man on military duty who was stationed at Dunbar, he was on the hilltops and he saw the angels taking Aidan to heaven. That young man was Cuthbert. And when I was the chief pastor of a church which had 6 denominations, building one family of Christians for one neighbourhood, we had to work out how we introduced new Christians in a church membership course, which was hell on earth. Could have been hell on earth, but it actually was quite heavenly in some ways. And so we taught the apostolic succession that some churches believe in, by having Jesus at one end of the room, laying hands on another person, who laid hands on another person, and then the last person had hands laid on, and it was the pipeline theory of Jesus' authority on earth, and it was rather impressive. And I thought, oh, we might convert to the apostolic succession. And then we tried the second form of apostolic succession, which was we sat round in a circle until we saw angels alighting on one person, and we responded. And we sensed that one person was coming to the fore to be our leader, and that was another form of apostolic succession, a prayer meeting in a circle. And I always felt that was very important, because God is not limited by the structures of human beings, whether it's extreme Protestant or extreme Roman. Well, that's the story of Cuthbert, who on this day, the 31st of August, saw those angels. Cuthbert is a giant of a man, and he probably needs at least a week's retreat rather than one session. And I've preached about him at St Cuthbert's Church, Edinburgh, which was founded by Cuthbert at the foot of the rock, the castle. And there's a wonderful room in the Church of Scotland church there, called the Lindisfarne Room, and the whole of one wall is a painting of Cuthbert going down, or up rather, the Firth of Forth, and alighting and discovering a well, which is no longer there, but it is in living memory, I think, the well, and establishing a church at the foot of the great rock of Edinburgh. But that was later in his life. Now we're going to, so he's such a giant of a man, I'm going to just go through different phases. This is Cuthbert the child. Now we don't know whether Cuthbert's parents, who were influential people, they were landowners in the Lammermuir Hills area of southern Scotland today, and some have speculated that they may have been friends of the royal family that sought refuge in Dalriada. That's also did we learnt about him when he embraced the faith there, and that Cuthbert's parents may have gone there and guarded the royal children and embraced the faith. Or, alternatively, very early on in Aidan's mission, they embraced the faith. All we do know is that Cuthbert came from a God-honouring family. He was a teenager when Aidan died, but he had, as a child, had experiences of God which were very remarkable. Now, I know children can have experiences of God, because when I was pastor at Bowthorpe, we prayed for the Spirit to come on a person, and the dog was slain in the Spirit and fell onto the floor out in the Spirit. And what the boy, David, we took to a holy shrine in Norfolk in eastern England called Walsingham, and in the middle of this shrine is the holy house full of candles and the Virgin Mary and so on, where a lady, Richeldis, had a vision that she was to create Nazareth in England, and that was the site years and years ago. Anyway, David went into this and he said, "I feel very naughty." And we said, "Why do you feel naughty?" He got a sense of sin. He picked up a sense of sin in a holy place. He was very sensitive to God as a child. Well, Cuthbert was like that. He was very strong, very acrobatic, very muscular. He was obviously a leader even amongst the children, and they were playing pranks and doing acrobatics in a field. And Cuthbert wrestled and took on everybody, and still won every wrestling match. And then a tiny little, so he was maybe, 12, 13, say, and a little 5-year-old boy said to him, "You should not be behaving like this, because God has called you to be a bishop," according to the story of Bede. It's probably slightly spruced up by Bede, but anyway. But Cuthbert didn't take any notice, and he went on playing around as teenagers do. But he was showing off a bit. And then the boy had a tantrum, as some children do. And he said, no, you shouldn't be behaving like this. God has called you to be a bishop. Stop behaving like this. And that time, Cuthbert, the headstrong teenager, held back. He knew that this little boy in a tantrum was from God in a way. And he stopped playing around stupidly and became more serious and thoughtful from that time on, according to Bede. Well, we'll stick with that. And I think that's a wonderful story. And there's another story of him as a teenager, which I think is remarkable, because teenagers in Britain, I don't know if they're like this in Africa, but they never will stand out on their own. They always go in gangs. So if you're in a place with a lot of crime, you always go in gangs, and you beat people up, but you wouldn't beat someone up if you're on your own, but in the gangs you do. So for a teenager to stand up against the whole crowd on a beach, I can't think of any teenager I've ever known, and certainly I wouldn't as a teenager have done this. Anyway, Cuthbert, I think he may have been on holiday, because he was down near the Tyne River, which is along 30 miles or something south from here. So it's quite away from where he lived, 40 miles or something like that, 50. Maybe they were on holiday. We don't know why they were there. Anyway, while people were enjoying the holiday sun, like today on this beach, they saw some monks, because Aidan's monasteries were spreading like wildfire all over the place. And these monks were taking big logs by boats across the river, which went into the sea. It was in the estuary, to build their monastery in the land by the estuary. And the wind had turned badly and was taking them out to sea. They were in danger of their lives, as well as losing their logs for building. And the men were all jeering them. They didn't like these newcomers, they didn't like these Christians. They were all pagans, you see. And saying, "Good riddance, may you perish in the sea, we don't want you here." And some of us had that experience. And so Cuthbert said, no, they're holy people. You shouldn't be talking like that. You should be praying for them. He was a teenager now, and he was tall, but nevertheless, who's going to take notice of a teenager? And so they didn't take any notice of him. And then Cuthbert lay prostrate on the beach with his hands up to heaven praying, and the wind turned, and the men who were going to lose their lives going out to sea came back to the place where they were delivering the wood to build the monastery, and all was well. And everybody on the beach was so awed, they were so thunderstruck by this teenager whose prayer, who had the courage to pray in the middle of a crowd, hostile crowd, firstly, and secondly, whose prayer changed the wind, that they became, says Bede, more thoughtful.
Yeah.
So they were, some of them may have gone to church as a result of that, we don't know, but it was a bit of a turning of the atmosphere in the population, that this new religion had more to it than they'd given it credence for. So that was the teenage Cuthbert and the child Cuthbert. So there we go. Well then, Cuthbert, as I mentioned before, sees Aidan going to heaven with angels, and so now he's very well off. He would inherit a large estate from his parents. He had a personal servant, a very fine horse, beautiful silk clothes. He had a career. He could have been the Prime Minister of Great Britain or the head of the United Nations, something like that, the equivalent. But God spoke to him that if holy Aidan had gone to heaven, he must offer himself to life service. Now, what was he doing? He was a warrior, and in those days I was required by law to join national service, we called it, after the World War II in Britain. Every male aged 18 had to go into 2 years national service, the military or something. I escaped it by 3 months because they abolished compulsory national service. At the time I was pleased, I now regretted it. I think it would have made a man of me. But anyway, he had to do national service as a warrior, and he was stationed at Dunbar, which was King Oswy's, one of King Oswy's military posts. And they were needed to be there because of invasions from north or west. And he was on duty, and he saw the angels taking Aidan to heaven, and he decided that as soon as his period of military service was over, he would report and become a full-time servant of God. So in due course he arrives at Melrose Monastery, probably because that was the nearest large monastery to where his parents lived, possibly because of the fame of its prior, Boisel, who was a very learned man. We don't actually know why he chose it, but he did. And Alistair Moffat has written a book, Towards the Tides of Holy
Island of Tides. Island of Tides.
Island of Tides, and it's walking the way up the River Tweed. And it's all, he investigates all sorts of traditions as to where Cuthbert lived, which is not what Bede says actually, but they're interesting. And anyway, he reported there, and he arrives with his horse, his silk tunic, and his servant, and his spear, or sword. And when he gets there, he gives his sword to his servant. The servant leaves with the horse, and he knows he has no personal property. This wealthy family, young man, sacrifices all personal property. So he didn't just want to get a job as a vicar, which would give him a nice stipend and a bit of goodwill and a free house. No, he wanted to give up everything for the rest of his life. And that's, of course, what monasticism is about. And Boisel was there and said to the monk next to him, "Here comes a true servant of God." He saw from the moment he saw him that he was a true servant of God. And so Cuthbert is a student. And in the monasteries, we don't know what they studied in detail, but we do know some of the books they had. They probably knew about Cassian's book, telling about the Desert Fathers, but they studied the Gospels first and foremost, and the Psalms. And we know that when Boisel got to the last week of his life, he said to Cuthbert, "What do you want me to spend the last week of my life on earth teaching you?" And Cuthbert said, the Gospel of John. And they loved the Gospel of John. So they learned the Psalms, they learned the Scriptures, they learned about the Desert Fathers and the early church, they learned Latin, and I dare say they learned how to take communion services and all that sort of thing like you do today. And so he was established there. And from that monastery, it was not like many monasteries of later centuries, which removed you away from the world so that you were apart from the world, because from the monastery they went on evangelistic tours. And so we then come to Cuthbert the evangelist. And unlike Aidan, he didn't walk everywhere, he rode a horse provided by the monastery. And he went far and wide, and typically he would go to a village and gather the people and preach to them, explaining perhaps part of a Bible or whatever. And then he'd say, is there anybody who lives, who's cut off, away from here? And they say, oh yes, if you go this track, 2 miles down there, there's a woman who lives down there. And he would go down the track and preach and tell this woman what he told the crowd. So he would never leave anybody out. And one day he was preaching, and some of the crowd jeered at him, and he implored heaven to come down, and there was a fire, and everybody was startled and paid attention. And he also used to weep, and we're told he wept because people told him so much of their life story, and he would weep. And when he celebrated the Holy Communion, which is part of evangelism, they didn't have all these different boxes, you have Holy Communion for one lot and evangelism for another lot. It was all part and parcel. But he would weep when he celebrated the saving victim. That's their name for the Holy Communion, the Lord's Supper, or the Mass, whatever you call it. The saving victim. And because he felt the pain of Jesus dying, and the Jesus' blood, as it were, coming into our lives. He was a very intense person. And we know quite a lot more about his evangelistic tours. And then I've had to make this new this morning because I realise it's badly left out. Cuthbert the Creation Steward. There are many stories of him helping people to understand that God comes to us through creation, and we are to help to restore communion between creation and God. Once he was tutoring a boy in the Teviot Hills, and he took him on a missionary journey to preach and meet people one by one as they journeyed. And as they journeyed, he said to the boy, have we got anything for lunch? And the boy thought, well, I don't have any relatives here. Did you think I might invite you in, to a relative who give us something to eat? And so he said, no, I don't have any relatives here. So what are we going to do? And Cuthbert said, God will provide. And a little further on, an eagle came and deposited a fish on a rock by the side of the track where they were walking. And Cuthbert said to the boy, I feel very sorry for this boy. He said, God has provided our lunch. You better go and get it. So the boy goes to the rock and picks the fish up, and thinking he's done what Cuthbert wanted. And Cuthbert says, haven't you forgotten something? Shouldn't you have taken half the fish back to our fisherman that God's brought to us? And so he brings half the fish back so that the eagle can eat half of the fish. But the poor boy doesn't know how they're going to cook it. So they carry on walking, and then the boy said, well, how should we cook it? And then they see a group of men with a fire broiling whatever they got for their lunch. And Cuthbert said, ask them if we can share. And Cuthbert was teaching the boy. He wasn't going to do it. And the boy asked the men if they could share their fire with the fish. And then Cuthbert says to the poor boy, haven't you forgotten something? You want to share our fish with the wren. So in the end, I don't think the boy must have had a tiny bit of fish. But maybe the men shared their broth with them. I imagine they probably did, and it was happily ever after. But it's a wonderful little glimpse. And at the end of his life, which we'll come to later when he was on Farne Island, if you go to the Farne Island today, if the ships are running, because they got a blight on the birds there, they present slightly over the top, I think, Cuthbert as the first environmentalist, first naturalist on Farne Island. But the thing is that he had a conversation with God, and God told him to go to the Farne Island, which we'll come to later. But the birds stole all the seed, ate the seed that he planted in the soil. And so he was like Francis of Assisi. He preached a sermon to the birds and said, look, I thought God had wanted me to come to this island. If he wants it to be entirely for you, that's fine with me, and I'll go somewhere else. But if God wants me here too, will you please stop stealing my seed? And then another lot from monk or two from Lindisfarne brought barley seed in August. Well, I'm not an expert on these things, but I don't think you're supposed to sow barley in August. You're supposed to sow it much earlier. But he sowed barley seed in August, and it came up beautifully, and he had a complete harvest, and the birds didn't steal it. And so he stayed there. And that is one reason, amongst others, why people call Cuthbert the first naturalist. Mm-hmm. But when later he was evangelizing the Picts up north, they were starving, but they prayed, and the dolphin, they had dolphin meat brought to them, so they ate dolphins, poor things. So it was quite remarkable how he and there's the other story when he's prayed all night and the otters warmed his feet in the morning. And the Sulpicius Severus, who wrote a biography of Martin of Tours, but also of Felix the Hermit on Mount Sinai, he says, when these holy hermits pray, they restore communion, and the animals come to them and the angels come to them, because they've got such inner quiet and such communion with God. There's restoring harmony between the animals and the angels, heaven and earth. I think that's the most beautiful insight, and it was true not only of desert fathers but of people like Cuthbert. But then Cuthbert, he's probably the most many-sided, most multi-talented man in the history of the British Church that I can think of. Cuthbert the host. They taught you to be hospitable, and at all times, but after a certain amount of time, he and his abbot Eata went to Ripon, where the Aidan mission was founding yet another monastery. And Cuthbert was the guest master, and it was winter. And one day a man arrived on a horse in the snow, and they weren't expecting guests. And Cuthbert, as the guest master, welcomed him. They didn't wash people's feet because you didn't need to. They washed their hands in warm water and bathed them as the equivalent of washing the feet. A wonderful way of offering hospitality to people in the snow. And then he sat the guest down and said, well, our meal time is whatever it is, midday or whatever, and I will bring you a hot meal at that time. So at that time he brought in the hot meal into the room where the guest was. The guest had gone. Cuthbert thought, well, that's very strange, because so he looked outside in the snow, and his horse had gone as well, but there were no prints in the snow. So he said, where had they gone? And he came to the conclusion, which Bede definitely came to the conclusion, was that an angel, the visitor had been an angel to test Cuthbert whether he was hospitable or not. Because, says Bede, those who show hospitality to strangers entertain angels without being aware of it. And so it was always believed that an angel had come to test Cuthbert's hospitality, and he was a very hospitable person throughout his life. But there's more yet. This Cuthbert, if we were as good as Cuthbert in any one of these 12 personae of Cuthbert, we'd be doing well, but he was good in all of them. Cuthbert the Pastor. Now, he not only preached to crowds, many individuals came to him personally, and he used to weep as people poured out their troubles, their sins, their troubles, their fears, their hopes, because he had empathy, he had emotional intelligence to a high degree. And people would come to him all the time. So he was extraordinarily energetic and physically strong, but he seemed to be almost tireless in reaching out to people and listening to their needs. And very much allied with his work as pastor was his work as a healer. And it probably began, for all I know, when he got the plague. The plague decimated monasteries all over the place, much worse than COVID. And COVID was child's play compared to these plagues. And I mean, people like Aidan could have given up in despair because half the things they'd established disappeared in a year. But anyway, it ravaged the monastery at Melrose, and Cuthbert himself got the plague and was lying in bed. But a brother came to him in the morning and said, we've been up all night praying for you. We've had an all-night prayer meeting for you. Now, some churches have all-night prayer meetings, and some people get a little tired of them after the first year, and so they stop having them. But anyway, Cuthbert said, well, if you've been praying for me all night, what am I doing here lying in bed? And he put one foot on the ground, and then another foot, and held on to something, and he had a limp. And he limped for the rest of his life, the wounded healer. But here is Cuthbert the healer, and he had some of the most amazing healing experiences. Some of them a bit like Pentecostals who pray over handkerchiefs, and then they send it to the sick person and they get healed. Cuthbert did that. He prayed over a handkerchief and sent it to somebody. And one of the princesses was on all fours. She just couldn't walk, and asked for his prayers when he was in Farnham and later in his life. And he prayed over moss and got one of the brothers to send to the moss that he prayed over, and she was healed. But many people who aren't mentioned are healed. There's one example of a sheriff whose wife had what probably today we would call a mental illness. And he said, please come to my wife, she's lost her reason. And Cuthbert said to the brothers he was with, take her the rein of this horse and put it in her hand. Now this is very good modern psychological. This is what they do today. I was told somebody has schizophrenia, talk about something totally practical like their shoelaces, completely unrelated to what they think is their illness. Anyway, Cuthbert took the rein of the horse and said, put this into her hand and she will be healed. As soon as the brother put the rein of the horse into her hand, she was healed. And all this sort of thing went on. So he had amazing skills, gifts, anointings, whatever we want to call it, as a healer. Is there anything else left? Yes, there is. Cuthbert as a mentor, or I would use the word soul friend. Now, he had a spiritual mother called Kenswith, and but he also was a soul friend to a hermit on Derwentwater, a little island now called after him. The hermit's name was Herbert, and it's called St Herbert's Island in Derwentwater. So he lived a hermit life, but he'd met Cuthbert probably while he was on a visit to Carlisle. I don't know how they met, or maybe he'd only gone to this island on Derwentwater after being this side of the kingdom. Who knows? But anyway, he asked Cuthbert to be his soul friend. Cuthbert was an incredibly busy person. I wouldn't have dared ask such a busy person to be sovereign. But Cuthbert said yes. And Herbert, when Cuthbert went to the Farne Island, the last part of his life, Herbert walked all the way from Derwentwater to Farne Island, which is a jolly long journey to walk, and stayed with him and then walked all the way back. However, one day when Cuthbert had been made a missionary bishop at the end of his life, after his 9 years on Farne Island, Cuthbert did an episcopal visit to Carlisle. Herbert turned up there to see him, and Cuthbert said, "This is the last time we shall meet in this life. Please make sure you tell me everything that is on your agenda for being dealt with." And Herbert wept, but poured out everything to Cuthbert. But then he said, "Would you pray that our day of resurrection will be the same day?" Now the Irish believed in a place of resurrection, and they'd be raised to heaven. And he wanted to die on the same day as Cuthbert. Cuthbert died on Farne Island. He died on the island in Derwentwater, which was many miles away. What is it, 200 miles? I don't know. A long way away. And they died on the same day, whatever it is. It's March, isn't it? The day in March, and went to heaven on the same day. So Cuthbert was a great soul friend, and Bede says that hundreds and hundreds of people revealed the secrets of their hearts to him. Now, I couldn't cope with hundreds and hundreds of people, but Cuthbert had a very unique ability to do that, and so he was a kind of mixture of pastor and soul friend in that sense, but at a deeper, more regulated way, he was a soul friend to people like Herbert. Well, we're not done with him yet, because he was also prophetic, and he prophesied all sorts of things, and they happened. And one day, his spiritual mother, Kensworth, he was visiting her when in her old age, and the little village where she lived caught fire, and her house caught on fire. And Cuthbert laid down on the ground in front of her house and started breathing heavily, blowing, blowing, blowing. And he said, "God will change the wind and the fire will subside." And so it did. So it was a combination of the prayer action and the prophetic insight with it. But he prophesied what would happen to people in the future, and they knew that. And so people went to see him saying, "Would you prophesy this, that and the other?" And when he was a missionary bishop at the end of his life, the Queen, the wife of Egfrith, who was a lousy king, a horrible man who killed people, he didn't like the Scots, he didn't like the Picts, he didn't like anybody really. But so he killed out right, left and centre. And this Queen who lived in Carlisle went to see Cuthbert, and Cuthbert said, your husband will die in battle, in this next battle in the next week or two. You must flee now to save your life. So she became a refugee before he was killed because of Cuthbert's prophecy. And he prophesied over many people, and I think his prophetic abilities were quite remarkable. But then there's yet another side of Cuthbert. Oh my goodness me, what a amazing thing is Cuthbert the manager. Can you think of anything? Well, they say all pastors start with the Holy Spirit and end up being managers. Well, not all, because we've got one or two here who've escaped that. But an awful lot do. It's an ever-present danger. And when the Synod of Whitby imposed the Roman regulations. All the Irish left Lindisfarne, and 30 of the English left Lindisfarne. But all the monks who remained were endlessly complaining all day about all the new regulations. It was about the worst post anybody in the world could ever be given. And they put Cuthbert in as prior. Now the prior is the guy who's the manager, he organises everything. The abbot's a spiritual man, you see, just preaches sermons, says amen, and the manager has to get everything right. And we're told that they met every day in council, as all the brothers who remained, and they came up with their grievances about this, that and the other, all the new regulations. So they hadn't got the oomph to get on their bike, to use a phrase from Margaret Thatcher's man Norman Tebbit. He said, if you can't get any work, get on your bikes. He wasn't worried about places being, looked after where they were. Cuthbert could have said, get on your bike. If you don't like it, get out. But he didn't. He listened to all their complaints night after night, but at 10 o'clock, or whatever it was, he walked out. And when he walked out, that brought the meeting to an end. So they had to stop all that complaining and go to bed, or prayer. And then he convened the next day calmly and happily, as if nothing was wrong. So this endless complaining and this lack of cohesion and purpose in this monastery did not destroy his own walk with God, his own peace, his own sense of balance and priorities. Remarkable quality. But instead of going to bed, which is certainly what I would do, and I'd take a gin and tonic, he went to the little island down there, which we now call St. Cuthbert's Island, for that reason. And he would pray through the night for all these lousy, bad-tempered monks who hadn't got the oomph to go to Ireland, but hadn't got the grace to put up with the new regulations. And he prayed for them, and he'd come back and said, and he's always kind, and he said, if ever you have any problem, call me at any time, day or night. Nothing is too much trouble for me. Now that is sainthood. Anybody who says that should be made a #1 saint. I couldn't bring myself to say that to certain people. But anyway, he said that, and we are opening some air because we're getting like the monks at Lindisfarne, we're getting stifled. So in the end, Bede says, gradually, slowly, he turned them round, and they came to accept. You see, Cuthbert didn't like the new regulations. He'd have much preferred the Irish ways. He voted against the Synod of Whitby, but he accepted it because this is what it is. I don't want my country to be like it is, but it is like it is, so we accept it. And gradually he turned them round, and we do know that the greatest days, well, in the world's eyes anyway, of Lindisfarne Monastery was after that. That's when the scriptorium grew famous, and it was the best art in the world, and it produced the Lindisfarne Gospels. And so the glory days were ahead of it. So it hit a very bad patch, and Cuthbert was the manager through the bad patch, and at the end of the bad patch it came into its glory days. So Cuthbert the manager, God bless him. Thank God we don't all have to be like that. And then, oh dear, I've lost. Oh, where are we? Cuthbert, there's so many other things as well. Yes, Cuthbert the prayer hermits. Now, I think I've mentioned already that after Aidan's death, some years after that, and after Cuthbert had been the guest master at Ripon Monastery, Bishop Wilfrid, the Putin of the church, came back from...
We need a special lecture on him.
He had a little sabbatical in Rome for 3 years, as you do, because he loved the glory of Rome and the pomp. And he came back to this provincial little island, And he said, oh, I don't want these Celtic types running my monastery at Ripon, so he threw them out. Cuthbert and Niata were thrown out of Ripon. Some of you may have been thrown out of something. It's not pleasant. So what were they to do? Well, according to Moffat's book on the borders going to Lindisfarne, they spent a lot of time in little woodland places and down the river. But I don't know how true that is, because they then made him manager of Lindisfarne. But anyway, what happened was, this is a theory which the novel by Catherine Tierney on Cuthbert points out that he and Wilfrid were born the same year. They were far the most able of the churchmen of their time, two outstandingly able, outstandingly energetic people. Wilfrid was the power politics man for the church. He wanted stone buildings which would last forever, beautiful big libraries, power and glory and ornateness. He wanted it to be like Rome. And Cuthbert had wanted to give up all his power and glory and become like Christ with nothing. And so what should he do? These two giants in one land, one church. Cuthbert decided to resign or to ask permission to leave his monastery and become like a desert father. The desert fathers fled to the cities where the churches were getting second hand and clerically dominated, and they went into the desert to live for God alone. So they had no power whatever. Cuthbert got permission to go to the Farne Island and become like a desert hermit. And he stayed there as a hermit for 9 years. Now when he went, it was said to be only the wild animals would go there. Although Aidan had a week's retreat there in the summer, so it was beginning to be known as a place for retreat, but in the winter nobody would go there. And some brothers from Lindisfarne were sent to help him build a stone chapel, but the weather was bad, so they didn't arrive the day they were going to. So they came back expecting to build it and found Cuthbert had already built it all on his own. He was very strong. And but he left the roof open. And Bede said, why did he leave the roof open? Bede, because he was a bit like that, said, oh, he was contemplating the heavens when he's sleeping at night. But I think it was very high walls to keep out the wind. But who knows why he left the roof open. But that was his cell. And then after a time he did build a little place by the ferry, so if anybody came on a boat to see him, they might have to wait 1 day, 2 days, 3 days or whatever, because he was a hermit. He got on with the birds, he preached, he prayed. Occasionally brothers from Lindisfarne would come over with food and they'd talk. And one day they came over at Christmas and they brought 2 geese for Christmas meal, and they were talking, telling stories, having fun. And Cuthbert was very, very serious, and they said, why are you so serious? And he said, because, my friends, your monastery and our monastery at Lindisfarne is being visited. And he meant plague had come to Lindisfarne, and it had. And he felt it in his spirit, although whatever it is, 9 miles away, across the sea on his own. And the brothers hadn't a clue from Lindisfarne, but they went back and found the plague had spread. So Cuthbert wouldn't eat the goose because he was so worried about the plague. So he was very, very sensitive. But he stormed the gates of heaven in intercession, and he was looking over the political kingdom, Bamborough. He could actually see people arriving if they came in a carriage or a group of horses. He could, and sometimes people came to see him. So although he was a desert father, his intercessions were informed and reaching into the power structures of the kingdom, even though he had no say in anything or no role in anything. And sometimes somebody would come on a boat and pray for healing. And once he left the Farm Isle to meet with Elfrida on Cocket Island and do some prophesying. So he was there for 9 years, and he would have died there, but Wilfrid overreached himself, and King Egfrid was as much a power politics man as Wilfrid. They hated each other because they both wanted to be boss. And so in the end, Egfrid put Wilfrid in prison, and then he exiled him to Sussex, where Wilfrid planted lots of church. He's known as the Apostle of Sussex. He was a dynamo, Wilfrid, there's no doubt about it. But he was exiled from Northumbria. And then all the people went on the hill by Almouth down the coast, which in those days was not cut off by a river as it is today, and they elected Cuthbert as their bishop. But, of course, he hadn't been asked. And he said, I'm not going to be a bishop, just because people want me to be. But the king, and there's a beautiful picture of this in St Mary's Church, near the altar on the side wall, the king and a retired Bishop Trumwyn went by boat to Cuthbert and said, you must become the bishop to replace Wilfrid. And all the people want you. He didn't want Wilfrid. And Cuthbert said, but I'm a hermit. And then he remembered that Boisel, who'd been the prior at Melrose, prophesied over him years and years before that he would one day be a bishop. And he said, I cannot be disobedient to a prophecy. Now that's another quite a key point, isn't it? If you know the prophecies from God, we've got to be obedient to it. And so very reluctantly, he agreed to be the bishop. And I think he was one of the greatest bishops in the world. Now, when I was asked to preach at St Cuthbert's Church, Edinburgh, I did some internet research, nothing to do with Bede. It's on traditions, and it's quite extraordinary the way Cuthbert planted endless churches in those 2 years. He planted church in Carlisle, he planted churches all over this area, but he not only planted the church in the shadow of the Rock of Edinburgh, he went as far as Dull, which is a little village. I think it's linked with another village called Boring in the USA, isn't it? Yes. Yeah. But if you go to Dull, which is the beginning of the Highlands, near the River Tay in Scotland, for quite a long way north, but that was the edge of Northumbria when, in those days, because Northumbria was quite a large area, he prayed in the cell, which is up the hill, quite a climb, not everybody would manage it. And it became a monastery and a place of learning, and according to the internet tradition, it became it merged into St Andrews University in Scotland, and St Andrews University endowed the monastery for years and years and years with an annual grant. So there was that link. So he planted churches all the way up there, and if you go to the golf course near Prestwich Airport, there's a St Cuthbert's football team in the third league down, I think the third most important Scottish football league, the St Cuthbert's football team. And lots of places are named after Cuthbert, all over Scotland and northern England. So that was his wonderful work as a missionary bishop. And he probably planted more churches than any other single person. But he only lasted 2 years, because he realised that he was going to die, and he asked to go back to Farne Island for the last 3 years of his life. And brothers from Lindisfarne, wanted to come over to give him onions or whatever they ate, and to be with him, but they couldn't because of bad weather. And Cuthbert said, I'm glad you could not come, because never have I fought with so many demons in the whole of my life as these last days. That's interesting. Just before death, he was fighting with demons. I wish I knew what they were. Were they inner demons, or were they demons to do with the kingdom or the church? We don't know. But he was fighting with demons. And then he did die, and that was that, or was it? We come to the last item of Cuthbert, and that is Cuthbert, the icon, the legacy. And here we come to the medieval passion for bones and relics, which is very alien to Lutherans and Pentecostals. But on the other hand, Jesus said, "My life comes to you through bread and wine." So if you believe that bones carry something of the person and the Holy Spirit can use them anyway, this is what people believed. Well, he did not decompose. So all the others, Aidan and all that lot, are decomposed. Now, I'm a skeptic. I think it's because they gave him the best quality coffin anybody had had, and so you lasted much longer. Aidan wasn't into anything like that. He just went buried on the beach and decomposed, and everybody else decomposed. But Cuthbert did not decompose. But this was announced as a miracle of miracles, as a super saint, and then so Lindisfarne became the premier place of pilgrimage in the whole of Britain. Other Canterbury equalled it probably, but nowhere else. It was absolutely vast. But it didn't last long because of the Viking invading. And when the Vikings invading, the brothers from this monastery took Cuthbert from his super quality shrine on Holy Island and made a portable shrine and started their walkies, which went on for years and years and years. And I've done some research on this, but it's a bit boring. But I've got a list here of 30 places that they stopped on their huge walkabout for years and years and years. So their idea was, so the Vikings had destroyed this place, but their idea was the church is a living church, and Cuthbert has risen from the dead and is leading his pilgrim people. And they thought at first God was calling them to go back to Iona. And they got the Lindisfarne Gospels, by the way, by then, and they put those in the shrine, as well as possibly a bit of Aidan's relics and a head of Oswald. And they were at Whithorn on the way to Iona when it was shipwrecked, and the Gospels were lost in the sea. And God said to them, "Search at low tide," and they found the Gospels, and quite astonishing, and they were not harmed. Come to that on another day. But anyway, they took it as God saying, "Don't go to Iona, turn back." And they stayed at Chester-le-Street for 30 years with the shrine. Flocks of people coming all the time to pray. And they went, half of them are in what is now Scotland and half of them are in what is now England. And then they said, well, where do we end up? And they, in a revelation from God, they said it's a place called Duncow. Nobody'd ever heard of a place called Duncow. But 50 years after his death, they heard a lady singing "Duncow, Duncow," and it was the field where her cow was. And so, in obedience to this prophetic word, they buried him in this field. Well, you don't know where it is now. It's down where Durham Cathedral is. And Cuthbert Shrine became the biggest shrine in England after Canterbury. Multitudes came to pray there. There were healings, and eventually they built a community of St. Cuthbert, married monks to look after it, and then eventually the cathedral grew and it's become what it is today, and Cuthbert Shrine is at one end. So he's become an icon of the great saint, totally overshadowing the simple Irish who originally came. And back here, the people at Durham thought, well, when they were drinking sherry one day, they said, I suppose we really ought to have a daughter house, because we say it's Cuthbert of Durham, but I suppose he really was of Lindisfarne. We better have a daughter house there. And so they built the priory, the remains of which you now see, much, much later, Benedictine. Top-down, feudal, Italians and French noble people as monks, and the poor islanders had to do the menial jobs. It never won the hearts of the islanders, and when King Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, the islanders took all the stones and built their places with it, and we used to have a place called the Open Gate, the retreat house, and the fireplace, all the bricks over the fireplace, stone over the fireplace, were taken from the dissolved priory. I say that because I think it's rather important we're aware of this, and so that is the story of Cuthbert, and it's so packed full of things that it's almost unbelievable. But I have got a list of spiritual exercises, but first of all, is there any questions anybody has about Cuthbert? Well, in the lull, I'll come in with this. My soul friend is called Peter Nielsen, he's a friend of Scott and Face too, and when he was a minister at St Cuthbert's Church in Edinburgh, he experimented with the possibility of a movement called St Cuthbert's Way, a way of life based on St Cuthbert. And there were regular meetings there of people from a wide area who wanted to consider a possibility of St Cuthbert's Way. We've now got the way of Aidan and Hilda, but this has the 8 things in the way, and people would study a different aspect. I'll leave them on the table. 1st vision, 2nd training, 3rd prayer, 4th soul friendship, 5th service, 6th healing, 7th unity, 8th prophetic initiative. That's Cuthbert's Way, and you can have a look at that. And so the question then is, there's an exercise for each of those 8 aspects of Cuthbert's Way, and I invite you to look at this and choose one exercise that you can do during the day. Thank you very much. God bless you all.